My father typed 37 words on a Sunday morning and thought he was closing a chapter. He posted it publicly, not on a private group, not in a text, not even in a voicemail. On his Facebook page, where 400 people from our church, his contracting network, the youth baseball league he'd coached for 11 years, and the neighborhood association he never stopped mentioning could all see it before their coffee went cold. The post read, "After much prayer and reflection, I've made the painful decision to cut ties with my daughter Reyna. Some people choose ingratitude over family. We wish her well but want no further contact. Please respect our privacy during this time." 11 reactions in the first 10 minutes. 3 crying emojis. 2 hearts. Someone named Donna Kiplinger commented, "Praying for your family." Gerald folded hands and my father replied, "Thank you, Donna. It's been hard but God's plan." He had tagged my name. Not my account. My actual name. So that anyone who searched me would find it. So that it would show up if a client Googled me. So that every person who knew us both would have to choose a side before they'd even heard mine. I found out the way you find out about most things that are designed to humiliate you, through someone else. My friend Carla texted me a screenshot at 11:14 a.m. with no caption. Just the image. Just those 37 words. Just my name sitting there in public like a verdict. I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on my kitchen counter and finished making my breakfast. That detail always surprises people when I tell it. They expect me to say I cried, or called someone, or drove over there ready to fight. But the truth is, when something crosses a line so far past what you thought a person was capable of, there's a moment of almost preternatural calm. Like your nervous system just decides, not yet. I ate my eggs. I drank my coffee. I sat by the window for a long time and thought about the one thing my father had not considered when he typed those 37 words and hit post on a Sunday morning. He had forgotten what I did for a living. And more than that, he had forgotten what I did for him. My name is Reyna Morales. I was 28 years old when my father decided public humiliation was a parenting tool. I want to tell you this story carefully, because the temptation is always to start with the anger. But the anger is not the interesting part. The interesting part is what happened 3 weeks later when he realized what those 37 words had actually cost him, and spent 4 days trying to make them disappear. To understand any of it, you have to understand what I did and what I'd been doing quietly for 4 years while my father told his golf friends his younger daughter worked in computers. I'm a digital operations manager. That's the long title. The short version is that I run the back end of things people depend on but don't understand. Websites. Automated billing systems. Vendor portals. CRM platforms. Email marketing pipelines. The plumbing of a small business's digital life, all the unglamorous infrastructure that has to keep breathing 24 hours a day or everything stops. I had built my own client base from scratch. By the time my father wrote that post, I managed accounts for 7 small businesses in the county, handled subcontract overflow for 2 regional marketing firms, and had just signed my first retainer with a commercial property group that paid me more per month than my father believed I made in a quarter. None of them knew the details. I'd stopped explaining my income after the 3rd time my father called it tech hobby money in front of company. But here's the part they never thought about. 3 years before the post, my father's contracting business, Morales & Sons General Contracting, which had no sons but sounded more serious, had been losing ground fast. His estimating process was still paper-based. His invoices went out late, sometimes not at all. He had a website that looked like it was built in 2009 because it was. He was losing bids to smaller competitors who presented better online because they showed up in searches and he didn't. My mother called me one Sunday and asked if I could just take a quick look. I took more than a look. Over 4 months, I rebuilt his business's digital infrastructure from the ground up. New website. Google Business Profile Optimization. An automated estimate follow-up sequence. A client portal that let him send invoices and collect deposits online. I connected his accounts to a job management platform, set up his QuickBooks integration, linked his vendor accounts so he could track material costs in real time, and configured his business email so it stopped going to spam. I did not charge him. He did not offer to pay. I told myself it was family. When the bids started coming in again, when a project manager at a commercial developer told him his online presence was the reason they reached out, my father bought himself a new truck and told people at church that he'd turned the business around. I was not mentioned. That was year 1. By year 3, he had grown comfortable enough with the systems that he assumed they simply ran themselves. He didn't know I still received alert emails when his SSL certificate was approaching expiration. He didn't know I had auto-renewed his domain name twice because the billing was still linked to a card that had my email as the account contact. He didn't know that his Google business listing, which drove roughly 40% of his inbound calls by that point, required annual verification that kept getting routed to me. He didn't know his vendor portal, the one he used to pull material quotes and track standing orders with his 3 primary suppliers, had me listed as the account administrator because I'd been the one to set it up and nobody had ever changed it. He didn't know any of this because he had never asked and I had never made it a production. My sister Daniela knew more than he did, but Daniela's version of knowing was enough to borrow from without wanting to understand. She worked part-time as his office coordinator, which mostly meant answering the business phone and reminding my father about appointments. She was bright and charming and had inherited my father's talent for making effort invisible. She kept the surface polished and let the machinery run beneath without questioning who ran it. My mother suspected more than either of them, I think. She had a quiet intelligence she used mostly to navigate my father's moods, and sometimes she looked at me with something like guilt she couldn't quite bring herself to name. But my father had a specific gift for mistaking access to something for ownership of it. He had used my labor so long without acknowledging it that he had genuinely rewritten the story in his own memory. The systems I built had become, in his telling, systems he had figured out. The results I generated had become, in his version, results he had produced. And I, the daughter who had actually built the plumbing, had become, in the myth he told himself and others, a girl who worked in computers and occasionally helped out. That is the thing about invisible work. Do it long enough, and the person you do it for starts to believe it was always just there. Like weather. Like gravity. He never thought to wonder what would happen when I stopped. The month before the post, things had been building in ways I chose not to name out loud. It had started at my cousin Marcus's engagement dinner. A long table at a restaurant with a private room, the kind of event that feels warm until someone decides to use it as an audience. My father was in one of his performing moods, the version of him that comes out in groups, louder than he is alone, funnier, more confident, needing to land every joke and be seen landing it. He'd been talking about the business, the way he did, carefully, so that everything sounded like a sole achievement. A new commercial client. A referral from the developer contact. A digital marketing presence that was, in his words, finally paying off after I put serious work into it. Daniela smiled and nodded from across the table. I kept eating. Then my Aunt Gloria asked the question she asks every time she sees me, which is some version of "and what is it you do again?" And before I could answer, my father said, not unkindly, but not carefully either, "She does stuff with websites. She's the tech girl." A few people laughed, the way you laugh at a label that sounds smaller than the person it's attached to. My uncle said something about how every family needed a tech person. Marcus said he wished he had one. My father refilled his glass and moved the conversation back to himself. I did not correct him. I had learned not to correct him in public. Every time I had tried, I'd been told I was making things uncomfortable, being oversensitive, taking a joke too seriously. The lesson I had absorbed over years was that in family spaces, I was expected to be a supporting character in stories I had actually written. I drove home that night and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Tiredness. The specific, bone-deep tiredness of a person who has spent years translating their worth into a language someone else refuses to learn. That night, I did something I almost never did. I pulled up my father's business accounts and looked at what I was still actively maintaining without being asked or thanked or compensated. The domain renewal I'd processed 6 weeks earlier. The Google listing verification I'd completed in March. The vendor portal where I was still listed as primary admin and where a standing order for lumber pricing was set to reconfirm in the next 30 days. The SSL certificate that would expire in 8 weeks and auto-renew only if the payment card on file was valid, a card I had never checked to see if my father had updated since I first linked it. I closed the laptop. I didn't do anything with what I'd found. Not yet. But I remembered it. 2 weeks later, I made a decision that had nothing to do with revenge. I had been offered a short-term project in another city, 6 weeks of on-site work for a retail brand doing a systems overhaul. The pay was significant. The experience was exactly what I wanted. I told my parents I'd be taking it, that I'd be gone through most of the following month and a half, and that they should make sure any business-related questions were handled before I left because I'd have limited bandwidth. My father's response was to ask if I could still handle small things remotely. I said I'd do my best but couldn't promise availability. He said that was fine, dismissively, the way people say fine when they mean this won't actually affect me. I sent him a list of things to check before I left. The vendor portal admin contact. The Google listing. The domain card. The SSL renewal. I sent it in a text, bullet points, clear and specific. He read it. He did not respond. I know he read it because there are 2 checkmarks and a timestamp. 10 days before I left for the project, the argument happened. It was on the phone, which is where our worst conversations always lived. My father had called to tell me he expected me at a family gathering the first weekend of my project, a birthday party for my uncle's 60th, 3 hours away and 2 days after I was supposed to start an intensive kickoff week with a new client. I told him I couldn't make it. He told me I was choosing work over family, which was something he only said to me, never to Daniela, whose social calendar he treated with the careful respect of a national holiday schedule. I told him I had a professional obligation I'd committed to and that I'd send a gift and call my uncle. He told me that my priorities were embarrassing and that I had always been selfish. I said something I had been keeping behind my teeth for a long time. I said that I had spent 4 years building the foundation of his business while he told people at dinner parties I worked in tech, and that if selfishness was the word we were using, maybe we should apply it more carefully. The line went so quiet I thought the call had dropped. Then my father said, very slowly, "Don't you dare speak to me that way." I told him I hadn't said anything that wasn't true. He hung up. I left for the project 4 days later. I did not call to smooth it over. I did not send a peace offering text. For the first time in 28 years, I let silence sit where an apology usually would have been. I was in the hotel room on a Sunday morning reviewing a systems audit document when Carla's text came through. I looked at the screenshot for a long time. After much prayer and reflection, I've made the painful decision to cut ties with my daughter Reyna. I want to tell you exactly what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what I expected. I expected rage. I expected the hot, immediate need to call him and say every word I'd ever swallowed. What I felt instead was something quieter and in some ways worse. It was recognition. The feeling of watching a person finally show you the shape of what they'd always been, not the version they performed for church friends, not the version that existed in family photographs, but the real thing. He had not called me to tell me I was cut off. He had not written me a letter. He had not sat me down. He had not even texted. He had performed my exile for an audience of 400 people, tagged my name so the humiliation would travel, and waited for the affirmation to roll in. And it did. Donna Kiplinger prayed for him. 3 people reacted with hearts. Someone from the Youth League wrote, "You deserve peace, Gerald." By the time I saw it, there were 31 comments. I read every single one. Not because I wanted to hurt myself, but because I needed to know exactly what the post had reached and exactly who had seen my name attached to my father's performance of victimhood. I found 3 clients. Not my clients. his people in his professional network who knew me tangentially, a developer contact I'd met at a function he'd brought me to, a property manager I'd spoken with while troubleshooting his vendor portal, a subcontractor who knew I handled the digital side of his business. All three had seen the post. All three had now been handed a story in which I was ungrateful, estranged, the problem. My father had not thought about what happens when you publicly discredit someone who has been operating quietly as a professional extension of your own business. He had not considered the optics of an active business account whose behind-the-scenes operator had just been labeled the bad child in a public Facebook post. He had not thought about any of it. Because in his version of things, I was the tech girl who helped out. Replaceable. Peripheral. A detail. I opened my laptop and pulled up every account I still had administrative access to on his behalf. I made a list. I sat with that list for 2 hours. Then I did one thing. I sent him a message, not on Facebook, not in a comment, just a private text, that said exactly this: I saw the post. I won't be available to manage any of your business accounts going forward. I'd recommend updating all administrative contacts and payment information at your earliest convenience. He did not reply. I closed the thread, opened my audit document, and went back to work. What came next, I didn't plan. That's the part one needs you to understand. I am not someone who schemes. I am not someone who sits and waits for a trap to close. I am someone who stopped doing something she had been doing silently for years, and then watched what happened when the silence finally had room to breathe. The 3 weeks that followed were the most clarifying of my life. The first week in the city was the best professional week I'd had in 2 years. The client was a regional retail brand doing a full digital infrastructure overhaul, 3 locations, a legacy POS system that hadn't been updated since before the pandemic, an e-commerce backend that had been duct-taped together by 4 different developers who never spoke to each other, and a team of 12 people who were smart, collaborative, and genuinely wanted to get it right. I showed up every morning at 8. I left most evenings after 6. I ate dinner alone at the hotel restaurant and read documentation on my tablet and felt, for the first time in a long time, exactly like the version of myself I had been working toward. I did not check my father's Facebook page. I did not reach out to Daniela, who had sent a single text the day after the post that said "Dad's really hurt Reyna," as if hurt were something that had simply happened to him rather than something he had staged with 37 words and a tag. I did not call my mother, who I knew would manage the situation by trying to manage me, softening, explaining, translating my father's cruelty into a language that asked me to absorb it more gracefully. What I did was work. And in the margins of working, I let go of the things I had been quietly holding for people who didn't know I was holding them. The domain auto-renewal that pinged my email, I logged in, removed myself as the billing contact, and left a note in the account that the primary cardholder needed to update their payment method within 30 days. The Google business listing that still had my personal email as the account manager, I submitted a transfer request to an alternate address tied to my father's business name and sent him an automated notification he would not understand and would probably ignore. The vendor portal where I'd been listed as administrator for 3 years, I downgraded my own access to read-only and sent a system-generated email to the account owner address, which was a business email my father checked inconsistently, informing him that admin permissions had been modified and he should log in to confirm account settings. None of it was dramatic. None of it was designed to cause harm. I was simply doing what I should have done years earlier, removing myself from systems I had no business maintaining for free while the person who benefited called me the tech girl at family dinners. I sent no explanations. I staged no confrontation. I just quietly stopped being the invisible hand that kept things running and waited for the natural consequence of that absence to arrive on its own schedule. It didn't take long. The first sign reached me not through my family, but through a man named Derek Paulson, the property developer contact I'd met at a function my father had brought me to 2 years prior. Derek had seen the Facebook post. He had also, apparently, reached out to my father's business line about a potential commercial project the following week and been given an estimate quote by Daniela that contained errors so specific they could only have come from pulling numbers out of a vendor portal she didn't fully know how to use. Derek, who was meticulous and had been doing commercial development long enough to spot when a subcontractor's backend was in disorder, sent me a message through LinkedIn. "Hey Reyna, hoping this isn't awkward given the recent Facebook situation, but I noticed some discrepancies on an estimate I received from Morales and Sons. I know you've handled their backend. Is there someone there I can work with directly on the technical side, or has the structure of that operation changed?" I read it twice. Then I wrote back clearly and professionally, "Hi Derek, I'm no longer affiliated with Morales and Sons in any operational capacity. For questions about their current team, you'd need to reach out to Gerald directly. Hope the project goes well." He replied with a thumbs up emoji and nothing else. But I knew what that thumbs up meant. It meant he was going to be careful. It meant a man who wrote contracts for a living had now clocked that the person who kept that business's digital infrastructure organized was gone and the business either didn't know it yet or hadn't prepared for it. I went back to my audit document and let the week finish. Day 11 was when the calls started. Not from my father. From Daniela. She called twice on a Tuesday afternoon, then once in the evening, then sent a text that said, "Hey, can you call me when you get a chance? It's about Dad's business stuff." I waited until the next morning and texted back, "I'm deep in a work sprint this week. What's the issue?" She replied, "The vendor portal isn't loading right and Dad can't pull the lumber quote for the Henderson job. He's supposed to submit by Friday." I looked at that text for a long moment. The vendor portal. The one I had downgraded my own admin access on. The one where the system-generated notification had gone to a business email my father opened sporadically. "He'll need to log in as account owner and reset the admin permissions," I texted back. "The notification should be in his business inbox." "He doesn't know his login," she replied. I took a slow breath. The credentials were saved in the shared doc I set up when I configured the account. It's in the business Google Drive folder labeled Vendor Accounts, Credentials. A pause of about 4 minutes. Then, "He doesn't know how to access that either." I put my phone down and went to my morning meeting. That was the thing about systems built by someone who understands them for someone who doesn't want to. They work flawlessly until the person who understands them leaves. Then every moving part becomes a mystery, and the person who never asked questions is suddenly standing in front of a locked door holding a key they don't recognize. By Thursday, the lumber quote had not been submitted. The Henderson job went to another contractor who had pulled their quote 2 days earlier. I found this out because the other contractor was someone my father had complained about at every family dinner for 3 years, a younger guy named Parker who had no real experience but kept winning bids my father felt entitled to. I heard about it from my mother, who finally called me that Friday evening in a voice carefully engineered to sound casual. "Hey honey. How's the project going?" "It's going well," I said. Good, good." A pause. "Your father lost a bid this week. The Henderson job." "I'm sorry to hear that." Another pause, longer. "He's having some trouble with the vendor accounts. Daniela said she reached out to you." "She did. I told her where the credentials were." "He can't find them." My mother's voice dipped slightly. "Reyna, I know the timing is complicated, but if you could just help him get back into the, Mom." I said it quietly, not unkindly. "He posted publicly that he wanted no further contact with me. I think that applies to his business accounts too." Silence. Then, "He was upset." "I know. He didn't mean it the way he tagged my name," I said. "On a public post. So that clients could see it. So that anyone who looked me up professionally would find it. He didn't do that by accident." My mother said nothing for a long time. I could hear the sound of the kitchen, a chair scraping, a cabinet closing. "He's worried about the business," she finally said. "Then he should log into it," I said. I sent everything he'd need. We said goodbye shortly after. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, and it had lasted under 4 minutes. By day 16, the consequences had stopped being singular. They had started stacking. The SSL certificate, the security layer that tells browsers a website is safe and keeps it from being flagged, expired on a Wednesday. My father's website, which I had been auto-renewing through a hosting account still linked to my email address, suddenly began throwing a security warning to every visitor. Anyone who clicked through to request an estimate or look up his services saw a red browser alert that said the connection was not private. The hosting platform sent automated notifications to the email on file. My email. I read them and did not forward them. That wasn't cruelty, it was the logical consequence of still being listed as the account contact after 4 years because no one had ever thought to change it. I had sent the text. I had sent the list. I had flagged it before I left. I had been ignored. The Google business listing began to slip. Without active management, flagging spam reviews, responding to questions, updating seasonal hours, confirming the profile information during Google's periodic re-verification requests, the listing's engagement signals started to decay. It wouldn't disappear immediately. But the calls that came through Google search, the ones that had been so reliable my father had bragged about them at the engagement dinner, began to thin. By day 18, he called me himself. I was in the hotel elevator when my phone lit up with his name. I watched it ring. I let it go to voicemail. He did not leave one. He called again 11 minutes later. I was back in my room by then, sitting at the desk with my laptop open. I let it ring. At 9:47 p.m., he texted for the first time since the post. Reyna. I need to talk to you about the business accounts. Call me. No hello. No acknowledgement. No reference to 37 words posted publicly 10 days earlier where he had told 400 people he wanted no further contact with me. Just an instruction. Just need, dressed as demand. I set the phone face down and went to sleep. The next morning, I had 7 missed calls. 3 from my father. 2 from Daniela. 1 from my mother. And 1 from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be my Uncle Hector, who had never once called me about anything in my adult life but had apparently been drafted into the communication effort. Daniela's text from the night before read, Reyna, Dad's website is showing a security error and clients are messaging him that they can't get through. He's losing jobs. Please just help fix this one thing. My mother had texted, please call your father. I know you're angry but people are calling about his website. My father had not texted. He had only called. He was, I knew, not a man who asked in writing because writing left evidence of having asked. That detail told me everything I needed to know about where we were. I was in the hotel gym when I decided what I would do next. Not from emotion, I had mostly moved past emotion by day 11, into something calmer and more permanent. I decided because I had thought it through and I knew exactly what I was and was not willing to offer. I would call him. Once. I would say what I had to say. And I would not fix anything he wasn't willing to acknowledge. He picked up before the second ring. Finally. The word like a door slamming. No preamble, no acknowledgement of the 11 days that had passed since a Facebook post with my tagged name in it. Hello, Dad. The website is down. The vendor login isn't working. I had to turn down a site visit for a commercial client because I couldn't pull the materials estimate. Do you understand what that costs? I let the silence stretch for a moment. Not dramatically. Just long enough to make clear that I wasn't going to answer the way I would have before. I sent you a list before I left, I said. 11 items. All the accounts that needed attention. The SSL renewal, the vendor portal credentials, the Google listing verification. I sent it in a text with bullet points. I saw the text. You didn't respond. I was busy. I know. I kept my voice even. And then you posted publicly that you wanted no further contact with me. A pause. When he spoke again, the bluster had shifted slightly, not to softness, but to something more careful. That was between us. The business is separate. It's not, I said. It was never separate. I've been managing your business accounts for 4 years. Without pay, without credit, without you telling a single person in our family or your professional network that I had anything to do with why your bids improved or why your website stopped looking like a 2009 brochure. And then you tagged my name on a public post and told the same professional network that I was the problem. He started to say something and I kept going, not loudly, not with heat, just with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation in the back of their mind for 4 years without knowing it. You listed Derek Paulson in your client testimonials, I said. I'm the reason Derek Paulson called you. I met him at the function you brought me to and followed up with him because I knew your digital presence could handle a commercial referral. That was me. And 2 weeks ago, Derek messaged me on LinkedIn because he noticed the back end of your operation had changed. That's what the Facebook post bought you, Dad. Your network knows something is different. They just don't know yet why. Silence. I could hear his breathing. Slow, controlled, the way it got when he was deciding between anger and calculation. What do you want? He asked. And there it was. Not I'm sorry. Not I shouldn't have done it. What do you want? Transactional to the end, because transaction was the only language he had left when his authority stopped working. I want you to take the post down, I said. Not because it hurts my feelings, but because it's professionally damaging and factually false. You do not want no contact with me. You want your vendor portal fixed and your SSL certificate renewed. A beat. And then what? He asked. And then we have a different conversation. One where you tell me what you actually think my work has been worth. He didn't answer that. I hadn't expected him to, not then. The post first, I said. Then we talk. I ended the call. For a long moment I sat still in the hotel room with the phone in my hand and the city noise coming through the gap in the curtains. I had spent 28 years waiting for my father to speak to me plainly, to acknowledge that what I did mattered, that I was more than the tech girl, that the invisible infrastructure of his professional life was not a feature of the universe but a product of my specific and deliberate effort. He hadn't done that on the call. But something had shifted in the quality of his silence. I had heard it. The silence of a man who had gotten very comfortable assuming the floor would always hold, and had just felt it move. I checked his Facebook page that evening. The post was gone. No statement. No apology. No explanation to Donna Kiplinger or the 3 people who had reacted with hearts or the Youth League father who had told him he deserved peace. Just gone, as if 37 words had simply evaporated from a Sunday morning and taken the comments with them. I screenshot the empty space where the post had been. I kept it on my phone. Not as a weapon. As a record. As evidence that words posted publicly with enough confidence to tag a name can become private enough to delete when the person who wrote them finally feels the weight of what they cost. He had spent 3 weeks building a story about a daughter who chose ingratitude over family. It had taken him 4 days to decide the story was no longer useful. That, I thought, was the most honest thing he had said about me in years. He called again 4 days later. This time, he left a voicemail. I listened to it once, sitting in my car in the parking structure after my last day on the client project. His voice was different from the one I'd heard on the call, quieter, scraped clean of the authority he usually wore like a second coat. He said he had spoken with Daniela. He said he understood the accounts were in worse shape than he realized. He said he didn't fully appreciate, and here he paused, long enough that I thought the message had cut out, what I had been doing. Then he said he'd like to talk when I was back in town. Not about the business. About us. I sat in the car for 10 minutes after it ended. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because the easy version of this story ends with relief. With the father who finally says the right thing and the daughter who finally feels seen. But real life doesn't work in clean resolutions. What I felt in that parking structure was something more complicated, a grief I hadn't let myself name while I was too busy being competent and contained and correct. The grief of a person who had needed something simple for a very long time and had learned so well to live without it that receiving even a fraction of it felt almost foreign. I drove home. I gave myself 3 more days before I called him back. We met at his kitchen table, the same table where he had once bragged about turning his business around by himself, where my mother had spent years pouring coffee for a version of this family that required me to be smaller than I was. He looked tired. Not broken, not dramatically humbled, just tired in the specific way of a man who has spent several weeks confronting the difference between what he believed and what was true. My mother made coffee and then found reasons to be in the other room, which was her version of giving us space. He started with the business because that was where he was most comfortable, concrete, transactional, easier to be accountable about than the rest of it. He told me the SSL certificate had been renewed by the hosting company after Daniela finally found the login credentials in the shared folder I'd pointed her to. He told me the vendor portal was partially functional but that a standing order had lapsed during the downtime and one of his primary lumber suppliers had bumped him to a standard pricing tier instead of the preferred rate he'd held for 2 years. He told me Derek Paulson had gone with another contractor for the commercial project. He said all of this to the table, not to me. Then he looked up. I didn't know how much of it was you, he said. I told myself I knew, but I didn't. Not the details. Not what would happen if you stopped. I didn't rush to fill the silence. The post was wrong, he said. It was, he stopped. Started again. I was angry and I wanted people to see me as the one who'd been wronged. I wasn't thinking about what it looked like professionally. I wasn't thinking about you professionally at all, which is part of what I got wrong. That last sentence landed somewhere tender. Part of what I got wrong. Not a full reckoning, but more honest than I had expected from a man who had spent decades curating his image ahead of his accountability. You called me the tech girl, I said. For 4 years. In front of clients, in front of family, in front of people who were directly benefiting from my work. And every time I tried to explain what I actually did, you treated it like I was asking for too much space at the table. He was quiet. I'm not saying this to punish you, I told him. I'm saying it because if anything is going to be different, you have to understand what the pattern actually was. It wasn't one dinner or one post. It was 4 years of being made to feel like a footnote in work I authored. My father is not a man who cries. But something moved across his face in that moment, not tears, but the particular stillness of a person who has just heard a true thing they cannot argue with. You're right, he said. Just that. 2 words. No speech. No qualifications. No, but you have to understand where I was coming from attached to the end. Just a plain acknowledgement dropped onto the kitchen table between us like something he'd been carrying for longer than this conversation. I nodded once. That was enough for now. We talked for another hour, practical things mostly, which was how we had always talked best. What it would look like for me to consult for the business going forward, on my terms, with a written agreement and a monthly retainer. What he would need to learn to manage independently so that a single absence couldn't destabilize an operation again. What the realistic recovery window was for the preferred pricing tier with the lumber supplier. I laid it out clearly and he listened in a way I wasn't sure I'd seen from him before, not waiting for his turn to speak, just listening. Before I left, my mother walked me to the door and held my hand for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, I should have said something. When he talked about you that way in front of people. I should have said something every time. I looked at her. Yes, I said. You should have. She didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't offer it automatically. But there was something in that small honesty that felt like the first real brick of something new, not the polished, frictionless family performance we'd always maintained, but something sturdier, built on what was actually true. That was 7 months ago. My life now looks different in ways I'm still getting used to noticing. I finished the retail project and picked up 2 more clients from the referrals it generated. I formalized my business structure, moved into a bigger apartment, and set up a consultancy agreement with my father's contracting company that has clear scope, clear compensation, and a clause that either party can exit with 30 days notice. The first time he told someone at a professional event that his digital operations were handled by my daughter, who runs her own consulting practice, I was standing next to him. He said it without prompting. I didn't make a scene of it. I just filed it away in the part of myself that keeps track of what costs something and what gets paid. My father and I are not the version of close that some families have, the easy, uncomplicated kind where history is either forgotten or rewritten. We are closer to honest, which in some ways is harder and in other ways is the only kind worth having. He still defaults to performance when he's in groups. He still takes up more room than he needs to at tables. But he has not introduced me as the tech girl since that kitchen conversation. And when something technical breaks in the business, he calls me instead of pretending to Daniela that he can handle it. Small things. But the small things are where character actually lives. The Facebook post is still gone. He never explained its absence to the people who saw it and reacted and prayed for him in the comments. I imagine some of them noticed. I imagine a few of them drew their own conclusions. I let that be his to carry. What I carried out of this was simpler and heavier at the same time. The knowledge that I had spent years making myself smaller to make space for a story about my family that wasn't true, and that the moment I stopped shrinking, the story had no choice but to change. You cannot publicly disown someone who was quietly holding the floor together without eventually standing in a room that proves it. He learned that. I hope he keeps knowing it. And I hope whoever is listening to this keeps knowing something too, that the work you do in the quiet, the systems you maintain, the problems you solve before anyone sees them become problems, that work has value whether or not it gets named at a dinner table. You do not need permission to stop carrying what was never fairly yours to carry alone. The post lasted 21 days. The work I did lasted 4 years. One of those things still matters. If you watched this far, you already know this story hit different. If you want more stories like this one, real ones, the kind people are afraid to tell, they're on your screen right now. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you there.